All British colonies participated to a varying degree in the Atlantic slave trade due to an abundance of land being cultivated by plantation agriculture and a growing European demand for colonial goods. The use of African slaves would grow as access to land and the availability of white indentured servants diminished. In this section, we'll discuss how the abundance of land and a growing European demand for colonial goods impacted the demand and supply of labor in the southern Atlantic colonies. As discovered in Chapter 2, the Chesapeake was hospitable to tobacco growth. However, tobacco growth quickly took its toll on the soil. Land exhaustion created an insatiable demand for new territory. Commercial growers moved further and further up the river valleys, provoking Indian attacks. By 1630, the Chesapeake had shipped 1.5 million pounds of tobacco to Europe. And by the end of the 18th century, almost 40 million pounds were being exported. Overproduction of tobacco eventually depressed prices. And while English colonists in North America should have taken a history lesson from their counterparts in England, and the results of the depressing wool prices should have taught them to ease off production of tobacco, farmers responded in the familiar way by trying to compensate for falling prices by planting more and more acres instead of less. This image is an early tobacco advertisement. A crude wood cutting like this were used to identify various brands of tobacco. One of the first products to be sold by brand name in advertising. You can see here the name of the product is the English of Raleigh. Europe's demand for tobacco meant an American demand for labor. Because of the imbalance between the number of men and women, the colonies could not meet labor needs through natural increase in the white population. Instead, plantation owners experimented in acquiring different sources of labor in the first part of the 17th century. As discussed in Chapter 2, Carolina colonizers enslaved over 10,000 Native Americans, but European diseases ravaged them, preventing this practice from spreading further where slavery was most prominent. And though the first recorded sale of African slaves in Virginia came shortly after Jamestown's settlement, African slavery, at least at the outset, was prohibitively expensive for Englishmen in the tobacco colonies. But England still had a surplus of displaced workers and farmers thanks to the crashing wool markets, and these men were desperate for employment. Colonial proprietors with the coin to do so invested heavily in the Headright system to encourage the importation of laborers and to expand their own acquisitions of property in the New World. Chesapeake planters recruited some 100,000 indentured servants to the region by 1700. These white slaves represented more than 75% of all European immigrants during the 17th century. Desperate men agreed to indentured servitude with the objective of trading their labor for a period of 4 to 7 years in exchange for transatlantic passage to their new homes in North America and freedom dues, which might have been some farming equipment, grain, and some bare essentials like clothing. Ultimately, the Headright system benefited landlords more than the laborer. Investors in the system received 50 acres of land. As land became more scarce, plantation owners stopped giving land to their former servants as part of their freedom dues. Desperate freemen attempted to improve their situation by journeying westward and squatting along the foothills of the Appalachians in the Indian Territory.